The decision to leave everything behind and start over in the Philippines didn't come overnight. It was a slow burn, a growing dissatisfaction with the life I had built in Chicago. For years, I had been grinding away at a corporate job that paid well but left me feeling empty. The long hours, the constant pressure, the endless cycle of meetings and deadlines, it all felt meaningless. I was 45 years old, single, and increasingly aware that time was slipping through my fingers. I didn't want to wake up one day, 20 years later, still stuck in the same routine, still alone, still wondering what could have been. It was during one of those late nights scrolling through the internet that I stumbled upon an article about expats living in Southeast Asia. The idea of a simpler life, where the cost of living was lower and the pace slower, intrigued me. And then there was Maria. We met on a dating site, and from the very first conversation, she seemed different. She was warm, attentive, and genuinely interested in getting to know me. Her messages were filled with questions about my life, my dreams, my fears. It wasn't long before I found myself looking forward to our daily chats, to the sound of her voice during our video calls. She made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in years. Maria lived in Cebu, a place she described as paradise. She sent me pictures of white sandy beaches, crystal clear waters, and lush green mountains. She talked about the friendly people, the vibrant culture, the delicious food. It all sounded too good to be true, but I was desperate for a change. I wanted to believe that this could be my chance at a fresh start, at finding happiness. So, after months of planning, I made the decision to move. The weeks leading up to my departure were a whirlwind of emotions. There was excitement, of course, but also fear. What if I was making a huge mistake? What if things didn't work out with Maria? What if I couldn't adapt to life in a completely different country? I pushed those doubts aside, convincing myself that this was what I needed. I sold most of my belongings, quit my job, and booked a one-way ticket to Cebu. When I arrived, Maria was there to greet me at the airport. She looked even more beautiful in person, her smile lighting up her face as she waved at me. Her family was there too, and they welcomed me with open arms. At first, everything felt like a dream. The warmth of the sun, the sound of the waves, the kindness of the people, it was everything I had hoped for. But it didn't take long for the cracks to start showing. The language barrier was one of the first challenges I faced. While Maria spoke English fluently, many of her friends and family members didn't. I found myself struggling to communicate, feeling isolated and out of place. I had expected to feel like an outsider, but I hadn't realized how much it would affect me. Every conversation felt like a reminder that I didn't belong. Then there were the financial pressures. I had done my research before moving, but reality was different from what I had read online. Yes, some things were cheaper, but others were surprisingly expensive. Rent in a safe, comfortable area was higher than I had anticipated, and imported goods things I had taken for granted back home were a luxury I could barely afford. Maria's expectations added to the strain. She assumed I would take care of not just her, but her family as well. It wasn't something we had discussed beforehand, and it left me feeling overwhelmed and resentful. The loneliness was perhaps the hardest part. Back in Chicago, I had friends, colleagues, a routine. Here, I had Maria, but she had her own life, her own responsibilities. I quickly realized that I couldn't rely on her to be my sole source of companionship. I tried to make friends, but it wasn't easy. The expat community was small, and many of the locals were hesitant to open up to a foreigner. I spent countless nights sitting alone in my apartment, wondering if I had made a huge mistake. But amidst all the challenges, there were moments of clarity, moments when I realized that this wasn't just about adapting to a new country or a new relationship, it was about confronting myself. Who was I without my job, without my old life? What did I really want? These questions haunted me, but they also pushed me to dig deeper, to find strength I didn't know I had. It wasn't easy, and there were times when I thought about giving up, about booking a flight back to Chicago and pretending none of this had ever happened. But something kept me going. Maybe it was the hope that things would get better, or maybe it was the fear of admitting failure. Whatever it was, I knew I couldn't give up not yet. So I started taking small steps. I began exploring the city on my own, forcing myself to step out of my comfort zone. I joined online forums for expats, where I found advice and support from people who had been through similar experiences. I even started teaching English online, which not only helped with my finances, but also gave me a sense of purpose. Slowly, I began to feel like I was regaining control of my life. But the biggest challenge was still ahead of me. My relationship with Maria. As much as I cared for her, I couldn't ignore the growing tension between us. The financial expectations, the cultural differences, The constant misunderstandings, it was all taking a toll. I knew I had to confront the situation, but I wasn't sure how. What would happen if I spoke up? Would she understand, or would it drive us further apart? For now, I pushed those thoughts to the back of my mind, focusing instead on the small victories. Each day brought new challenges, but also new opportunities to learn and grow. I was beginning to see that this journey wasn't just about finding a new life, it was about discovering who I was and what I was capable of. And maybe, just maybe, that was worth all the struggles. The days turned into weeks, and the initial excitement of being in a new country began to fade, replaced by a growing sense of unease. The challenges I faced were no longer just minor inconveniences. They were constant reminders of how out of place I felt. The language barrier, which I had initially brushed off as something I could overcome with time, became a source of frustration. Every conversation was a struggle, every interaction a reminder that I was an outsider. I found myself relying heavily on Maria to translate, to explain, to bridge the gap between me and the world around me. But even she had her limits. She had her own life, her own responsibilities, and I couldn't expect her to be my constant guide. The financial pressures were another weight on my shoulders. I had come to the Philippines with a plan, or at least what I thought was a plan. I had savings, a modest budget, and the expectation that my money would stretch further here than it ever could back in the States. But reality had a way of shattering expectations. The cost of living, while lower in some areas, was higher in others. Rent in a safe, comfortable neighborhood was more than I had anticipated, and the little luxuries I had taken for granted back home, like a reliable internet connection or imported groceries, were now expenses I had to carefully consider. Maria's expectations only added to the strain. She had never explicitly said it, but it was clear that she expected me to take care of not just her, but her family as well. It wasn't something we had discussed before I moved, and it left me feeling trapped. I wanted to be generous, to help where I could, but I also needed to be realistic. My savings weren't endless, and I couldn't afford to support an entire household. The more I tried to explain this to Maria, the more distant she became. It was as if she saw my reluctance as a betrayal, a sign that I wasn't fully committed to her or to our life together. The loneliness was perhaps the hardest part. Back in Chicago, I had a network of friends, colleagues, and acquaintances. Even if I didn't see them often, I knew they were there. Here, I had Maria, but she couldn't be everything to me. She had her own life, her own friends, her own family. I tried to make connections, to build a social circle of my own, but it wasn't easy. The expat community in Cebu was small, and many of the locals were hesitant to open up to a foreigner. I spent countless nights sitting alone in my apartment, staring at the walls and wondering if I had made a huge mistake. But amidst all the challenges, there were moments of clarity. Moments when I realized that this wasn't just about adapting to a new country or a new relationship, it was about confronting myself. Who was I without my job, without my old life? What did I really want? These questions haunted me, but they also pushed me to dig deeper, to find strength I didn't know I had. It wasn't easy, and there were times when I thought about giving up, about booking a flight back to Chicago and pretending none of this had ever happened. But something kept me going. Maybe it was the hope that things would get better, or maybe it was the fear of admitting failure. Whatever it was, I knew I couldn't give up, not yet. So I started taking small steps. I began exploring the city on my own, forcing myself to step out of my comfort zone. I joined online forums for expats, where I found advice and support from people who had been through similar experiences. I even started teaching English online, which not only helped with my finances, but also gave me a sense of purpose. Slowly, I began to feel like I was regaining control of my life. But the biggest challenge was still ahead of me, my relationship with Maria. As much as I cared for her, I couldn't ignore the growing tension between us. The financial expectations, the cultural differences, the constant misunderstandings, it was all taking a toll. I knew I had to confront the situation, but I wasn't sure how. What would happen if I spoke up? Would she understand, or would it drive us further apart? For now, I pushed those thoughts to the back of my mind, focusing instead on the victories. Each day brought new challenges, but also new opportunities to learn and grow. I was beginning to see that this journey wasn't just about finding a new life, it was about discovering who I was and what I was capable of. And maybe, just maybe, that was worth all the struggles. The turning point came on a particularly humid afternoon, when the weight of everything I had been carrying finally became too much to bear. I had just returned from a frustrating trip to the market, where I had struggled to communicate with the vendors and ended up paying far more than I should have for a few basic groceries. Maria had promised to come with me, but at the last minute she had canceled, saying she had to help her mother with something. It wasn't the first time she had bailed on me, and it wouldn't be the last. But that day, something inside me snapped. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the bags of overpriced groceries, and felt a wave of anger and helplessness wash over me. I had left everything behind for a life that was supposed to be better, for a relationship that was supposed to make me happy. But instead, I felt more alone and more lost than ever. I knew I couldn't keep going like this. Something had to change. It was around that time that I met Mark, an Australian expat who had been living in Cebu for over 5 years. We crossed paths at a small cafe near my apartment, where I had gone to escape the stifling heat and my own thoughts. He struck up a conversation, and before long, we were swapping stories about our experiences as foreigners in the Philippines. Mark had been through it all: the culture shock, the financial struggles, the relationship challenges. But he had come out the other side, and he had a wealth of advice to share. One of the first things he told me was that I needed to stop relying so much on Maria. "You can't expect her to be your everything," he said. "She's got her own life, her own struggles. If you want to make this work, you need to find your own way." It was a hard truth to hear, but I knew he was right. I had been putting too much pressure on Maria, expecting her to fill the void that I had been carrying for years. But that wasn't fair to her, and it wasn't fair to me. Mark also introduced me to a network of expats who met regularly to share tips, resources, and support. Through them, I learned about ways to save money, navigate the local bureaucracy, and even find part-time work. I started teaching English online, which not only helped with my finances, but also gave me a sense of purpose. For the first time in months, I felt like I was taking control of my life. But the biggest change came from within. As I spent more time on my own, exploring the city and meeting new people, I began to see things differently. I realized that my unhappiness wasn't just about the challenges I was facing, it was about the expectations I had brought with me. I had come to the Philippines with the idea that it would be a fresh start, a chance to leave all my problems behind. But the truth was, I had brought those problems with me. They were a part of me, and no amount of sunshine or sandy beaches could make them disappear. I also began to see Maria in a new light. She wasn't the perfect, idealized partner I had imagined her to be. She was human, with her own flaws and struggles, and while I still cared for her deeply, I knew that our relationship couldn't be the foundation of my happiness. I had to find that within myself. The decision to confront Maria about our relationship wasn't an easy one. I knew it would be painful for both of us, but I also knew it was necessary. One evening, after a particularly tense dinner, I sat her down and told her how I was feeling. I explained that I couldn't keep up with the financial expectations, that I needed more independence, and that I wanted us to be equals in our relationship. Her reaction was mixed. On one hand, she seemed to understand where I was coming from, but on the other, she was hurt and defensive. She accused me of not being committed, of not understanding her culture and her family's needs. It was a difficult conversation, and it didn't end with any clear resolutions. But it was a start. In the weeks that followed, we both made an effort to communicate more openly and honestly. It wasn't easy, and there were still moments of tension and misunderstanding, but slowly, we began to find a new balance. I started setting clearer boundaries, and Maria began to respect them. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. As for me, I continued to focus on building my own life. I explored the island, made new friends, and even started learning a bit of the local language. It wasn't always easy, but it was rewarding. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was truly living, not just surviving. Looking back, I can see how far I've come. The journey hasn't been easy, and there have been plenty of setbacks along the way. But I've learned so much about myself, about relationships, and about what it means to truly start over. And while I still don't have all the answers, I know one thing for sure. I'm not the same person I was when I first arrived in the Philippines. And maybe, just maybe, that's the point. The months that followed my conversation with Maria were a mix of progress and setbacks, a constant push and pull as we tried to navigate the complexities of our relationship and our individual lives. There were moments when it felt like we were finally on the same page, when the tension between us eased and we could laugh together like we used to. But there were also moments when the weight of our differences felt insurmountable, when I wondered if we were fighting a losing battle. One of the biggest challenges was finding a balance between my need for independence and Maria's expectations. She had grown up in a culture where family came first, where it was normal to share resources and support one another financially. For her, asking me to contribute to her family's needs wasn't unreasonable, it was simply what people did. But for me, it felt like a burden, a constant reminder that I wasn't just in a relationship with Maria, but with her entire family. I tried to explain my perspective, to set boundaries that would allow me to help without feeling overwhelmed. But it wasn't easy. Every conversation about money seemed to end in frustration, with Maria accusing me of being selfish and me feeling like my concerns were being dismissed. It was a cycle that left us both exhausted and resentful. At the same time, I was grappling with my own sense of identity. Back in Chicago, I had defined myself by my job, by my role as a provider and a professional. But here, I was none of those things. I was just John, the foreigner trying to figure out how to live in a country that wasn't his own. It was a humbling experience, one that forced me to confront questions I had been avoiding for years. Who was I without my career? What did I really want out of life? And was I willing to make the sacrifices necessary to find it? The answers didn't come easily. There were days when I felt like I was making progress, when I could see a path forward. But there were also days when I felt completely lost, when the weight of my decisions threatened to crush me. On those days, I found solace in the small things, the sound of the waves crashing against the shore, the taste of fresh mangoes from the market, the kindness of strangers who went out of their way to help me. One of those strangers was a woman named Lena, who ran a small sari-sari store near my apartment. She was in her 60s, with a warm smile and a no-nonsense attitude that reminded me of my grandmother. We struck up a friendship, and she quickly became a source of wisdom and support. She taught me how to haggle at the market, how to cook simple Filipino dishes, and how to navigate the complexities of local customs. But more than that, she reminded me that I wasn't alone. Life is hard, she told me one day as we sat outside her store sipping coffee. But it's also beautiful. You just have to keep going even when it feels like you can't. Her words stayed with me, a reminder that I wasn't the only one struggling, that everyone had their own battles to fight. And slowly, I began to find my footing. I continued teaching English online, which gave me a sense of purpose and a steady income. I also started volunteering at a local community center, where I helped teach English to children. It was a small way to give back, but it made me feel like I was contributing something meaningful. As for Maria, we continued to work on our relationship, though it wasn't always easy. There were times when it felt like we were speaking different languages, when the cultural divide between us seemed too wide to bridge. But we kept trying because we both cared enough to fight for what we had. One of the things that helped was finding common ground. We discovered that we both loved hiking, and we started exploring the island's trails together. Those moments, when it was just the two of us surrounded by nature, were some of the happiest we had shared in a long time. They reminded me of why I had fallen for her in the first place, of the connection we had built despite all the challenges. But even as our relationship improved, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. I had come to the Philippines looking for a new life, for a sense of belonging. And while I had found pieces of that, I still felt like I was searching for something more. Around that time that I received an email from an old colleague in Chicago offering me a job. It was a good opportunity, one that would allow me to return to the career I had left behind. But it also meant leaving behind everything I had built in the Philippines, me relationship with Maria, my friendships, the life I had worked so hard to create. The decision wasn't an easy one. On one hand, I had come to love the Philippines, with its vibrant culture and breathtaking landscapes. I had grown attached to the people I had met, to the sense of community I had found. But on the other hand, I couldn't ignore the part of me that missed the familiarity of home, the stability of a career, the comfort of being surrounded by people who understood me without explanation. In the end, I realized that there was no right or wrong answer, no perfect solution. Life was messy, and sometimes the best you could do was make a choice and hope for the best. So, after much thought and many conversations with Maria, I decided to take the job. The weeks leading up to my departure were bittersweet. Maria and I spent as much time together as we could, trying to make the most of the time we had left. We talked about the future, about the possibility of her visiting me in Chicago or me returning to the Philippines someday. But we both knew that things would never be the same. On my last day in Cebu, Maria and I went to the beach, the same one where we had shared so many memories. We sat on the sand, watching the sun set over the water, and for a moment, everything felt perfect. But then the moment passed, and reality set in. "I'm going to miss you," she said, her voice trembling. "I'm going to miss you too," I replied, feeling the weight of everything we had been through. And as I boarded the plane the next day, I couldn't help but wonder if I had made the right choice. But deep down, I knew that this was just another chapter in my journey, another step toward finding the life I was meant to live. The return to Chicago was both familiar and foreign, like stepping into a pair of old shoes that no longer fit quite right. The city was the same, the towering skyscrapers, the bustling streets, the relentless energy, but I was different. The months I had spent in the Philippines had changed me in ways I was still trying to understand. I had gone there searching for something, and while I wasn't sure I had found it, I knew I had left a piece of myself behind. The job I had accepted was a good one, offering stability and a sense of purpose that I had been missing. But it wasn't the same as before. The corporate world felt smaller now, its challenges less significant compared to what I had faced in the Philippines. I found myself questioning the value of what I was doing, wondering if this was really where I belonged. Maria and I stayed in touch, though the distance made things difficult. We talked on the phone, sent messages, and even video chatted, but it wasn't the same as being together. The connection we had built was still there, but it was strained by the miles between us and the uncertainty of what the future held. In the meantime, I tried to rebuild my life in Chicago. I reconnected with old friends, some of whom were surprised to see me back. They asked about my time in the Philippines, and I did my best to explain, though it was hard to put into words. How could I describe the beauty of the islands, the warmth of the people, the challenges I had faced, and the lessons I had learned? It was a story that felt too big to tell, too personal to share. One of the people I reconnected with was Sarah, a former colleague who had always been a good listener. Over coffee one afternoon, I found myself opening up to her in a way I hadn't expected. I told her about Maria, about the struggles we had faced, and about the decision to come back to Chicago. "Do you regret it?" she asked, her eyes searching mine. I thought about it for a moment before answering. "I don't know," I admitted. "I think I needed to come back to see if this is where I'm supposed to be, but I also miss the life I had there. It's complicated." Sarah nodded, understanding in a way that only someone who had been through their own struggles could. "Life is complicated," she said, "but it's also full of possibilities. Maybe you don't have to choose between one life and the other. Maybe you can find a way to have both." Her words stayed with me, a reminder that life didn't have to be an either-or proposition. Maybe there was a way to bridge the gap between the two worlds I had come to love. As the months passed, I began to explore that idea. I started looking for ways to incorporate the lessons I had learned in the Philippines into my life in Chicago. I volunteered at a local community center, teaching English to immigrants and refugees. It was a small way to give back, but it gave me a sense of purpose that my corporate job couldn't. I also started thinking about the future, about what I really wanted. The job I had taken was a good one, but it wasn't my passion. I had always loved writing, and I began to wonder if that was something I could pursue more seriously. It was a scary thought, the idea of stepping away from the security of a steady paycheck to chase a dream. But it was also exciting, a reminder that life was too short to settle for anything less than what made me truly happy. Maria and I continued to talk, though the distance between us remained a challenge. We both knew that our relationship couldn't stay in limbo forever, that we would eventually have to make a decision about where we stood. But for now, we were content to take things one day at a time, to see where life would take us. One evening, as I sat in my apartment looking out at the city skyline, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened. The journey I had been on from Chicago to the Philippines and back again had been anything but easy. There had been moments of joy and moments of heartbreak, times when I felt like I was on top of the world and times when I felt completely lost. But through it all, I had learned something important, that life was about more than just finding the right place or the right person. It was about finding yourself, about embracing the journey and all its twists and turns. I didn't know what the future held, but I was okay with that. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be, not because I had all the answers, but because I was willing to keep searching for them. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough.